Welcome everyone to this Griffith Institute for Educational Research Big Picture Talk. I'm Stephen Hodge, Director of the Institute and Chair of today's session. I'll start by acknowledging that the university campuses are situated on the unceded lands of the Jagera, Turrbal, Yuggera, Yuggera, Yugambeh and Kombumerri peoples. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all our Indigenous colleagues and students. Today's talk is given by Jill Blackmore, Member of the Order of Australia and Fellow of the Academy for Social Sciences in Australia. Jill is Distinguished Professor, Deakin Distinguished Professor and Professor of Education at Deakin University and former President of both AARE and the Australian Association of University Professors. Jill's research takes a feminist perspective on education policy and governance, school autonomy reform, gender equity reform, leadership and organisational change, international and intercultural education, gendered labour markets and employability, and teachers' and academics' work, health and well-being. In all her research, Jill's focus is on sustainable, equitable, inclusive and safe educational organisations and workplaces. I should add that Jill is a prolific researcher with 371 publications listed on her Google Scholar profile. On a personal note, I deeply respect Jill for her fearless, rigorous and uncompromising work to expose the many ways that education policy, corporations, systems and institutions can work against the interests of vulnerable groups, not only students, but all those whose careers and lives play out in these settings. I'm sure that a great many educational researchers will share this sentiment. Finally, today's talk will be recorded. After Jill's presentation, there will be time to take some questions. There's a question and comment facility for you to use, and the notes are moderated, so there will be a slight delay with your questions coming through. There will be time at the end for discussion, and you'll be able to turn your camera on and your microphone on and talk during that time. But just please keep your cameras and microphones off at first. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Professor Jill Blackmore and her talk today on a closed circuit of influence, evidence, the science of learning and education policy actors. Over to you, Jill.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for your kind words. Yes, and thank you for the Institute for providing the capacity to speak to a large number of people. So I, first of all, also would like to acknowledge country in the spirit of reconciliation and truth-telling, and the traditional custodians of a country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. In this country, sovereignty has never been ceded, and I'm currently standing on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations in Melbourne, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emergent, as well as any colleagues in this session. So, I mean, we are all in a real and distributed form, and as such, let us take a moment to think about the ancestry of the land that we are on and on our own ancestry. So, yes, thank you for this. So, by the way, a paper is available through Steve or myself around this particular talk. So, for those who can't attend, I want to start off with the voice of a early childhood teacher. Who said, "I don't know how many of you have been involved in teaching beginners to read, but the new regime in Victorian education are extremely ignorant about it. This is the information primary school principals receive today about the new literacy assessments for Foundation and Year 1. The English online assessment, which they are about to abandon altogether, helps teachers to find out what children know about reading books when they start at school. For example, concepts of print, left to right, top to bottom, names of letters, book handling knowledge, etc. This is all important for the foundation teachers to know where to start with each student in the teaching of reading. If students don't even yet know which is the right way to hold up a book, why would you start to teach letter sound knowledge for reading? The new regime is not interested in any of that. They just want a phonics test." Okay, so that's the starting point for this particular discussion. What I'm particularly concerned about here is the fast-travelling policies of the science of learning. And we've often talked about how travelling policies occur between internationally coming into Australia and vice versa. But what has been astonishing here is the speed with which it's happened in Australia with regard to the science of learning. In New South Wales, for example, Professional Development Day has focused on explicit teaching in all of its 2,000 government schools. Phonics, explicit or direct instruction, often used interchangeably as terms, and knowledge-rich curriculum based on the science of learning has been promoted in various reports on teacher education, such as TEEP. The Catholic Education Office has also views explicit instruction and cognitive load theory as instructional revolution leading to failure-proof teaching. New South Wales Department of Education Centre for Educational Statistics and Evaluation, known as CC, published a cognitive load theory in practice, which claims that CLT is the single most important thing teachers need to know. Behaviour management has now become a key issue across all these areas, and there's claims that explicit instruction is the best way to manage behaviour. AERO's How Students Learn Best report claims that cognitive load theory is about maximising learning by designing instruction to account for the limits of students' working memory and cognitive overload. So these are the current policies that are currently occurring right across every sector, except largely the independent sector, but certainly the Catholic and state sectors across Australia. So what is the problem here about the science of learning? Well, first of all, the speed and spread with which these notions of CLT, explicit or direct instruction, or the science of learning have been taken up and mandated by Australian Labor and coalition governments and other education systems, such as in the UK and New Zealand. This is quite astonishing. The mandating of how to teach literacy and numeracy for all students by state and federal governments and Catholic education system is an unprecedented intervention, telling teachers how to teach, and that for the first time such policies are being part of the condition of the better and fairer agreements between the Australian federal and state governments, which provides funding for public schools. Now, this agreement is meant to be able to rectify the inequality and underfunding of public schools and so-called underachievement, according to the long-held Gonski report. The other concern is the substantive evidence of a range of policy actors who have been actively involved in actively promoting the science of learning. These include philanthropists, the Productivity Commission, the Australian Council for Education, the AERO, the Australian Education Research Organisation, and other curriculum online providers, promoting this one strand of the science of learning. And the worry is that all of these proposals have been appointed by both the right-wing media, such as the Australian conservative think tanks, such as the Centre for Independent Studies, Independent Public Affairs, and the so-called progressive, questionable, think tanks such as the Griffith Institute. So why this spread? Well, what I'm arguing here is, drawing on the work of my colleague Emma Rowe, is that we have a small number of actors or knowledge brokers who are citing each other in a very close circle of influence in offering the same solutions to what is considered to be the problem of underachievement in Australia. And it is this convergence that needs to be analysed, because it has severe implications for teachers and students, as well as education researchers like ourselves. So I want to go through a bit of the background, first of all, about the evidence-based policy and the notion of what works. This is not new. First of all, the what works arguments originated in the 1990s in the context of the intersection of epistemological debates about the nature of knowledge production, the role of university-based research in relation to policy, and the location of teacher education. And all of these were largely driven by conservative neoliberal political agendas. There was also an increasing focus on the notion of we need greater applied knowledge and interdisciplinarity to solve the so-called wicked problems that we all confront. Schools and universities during the 1990s, as the other public sectors in the New Zealand, UK and Australia, had been also impacted at that time by new public management and neoliberal market reforms. And the argument of the NPM, New Public Management, was that the professions had captured their fields. Producer-captured arguments were put that public sector professionals, such as teachers, were invested in and protected the fields purely for their own self-interest and benefit, and that they had to bring in generic managers needed to manage the fields over which they had no expertise. Also at the same time, of course, during the 1990s, you had devolved governance to self-managing institutions, and the argument was that decision-making was more efficient at the interface in a market-driven system based on consumer choice and competition. And we know the impacts of that. We've done the amount of research about how that's led to greater inequality. At the same time, if you devolve governance down to independent institutions competing against each other, you have to have a type of steering mechanism for these self-managing institutions, and that's where the role of policy and funding is so important, because it's the policy frames the actions of these bodies, as does funding, and then you have to have incredibly strong accountability mechanisms that look at the output, and so the introduction of standardised assessment and KPIs and things like that. At the same time, since the 1990s, we've seen the rise of educapitalism as education and data have been the new sources of profit, of privatisation. You've seen the increased involvement of philanthropic organisations as state funding has decreased. And you've seen this discourse of evidence-based practice has led to the medicalisation of education, in which big science and big data are being re-engineered through educational assessment and practice, and the promotion of things such as randomised controlled trials. So all of these things were really emerging out of the 1990s. And there was then, at that time, what could be called the Anglophone policy pathology about evidence. David Hargrave started this off in education. He was a professor. In 1996, he claimed that education research is remote from practice, poor quality, and a waste of public money, and that teaching should be evidence-based as in medicine and what works. Then you have in the medicine, the examples often given are that of the Cochrane collaboration, which is a huge database of evidence. Interestingly, it was widening its criteria to include qualitative research at the same time in education. We were told we had to go down the RCT track. Similarly, the Campbell collaboration, which is a type of systematic research synthesis in the social sciences and policy, did have a wide notion of what constitutes evidence. At the same time, the TTAV in the UK had pushed teacher education out into the schools in a very much of a practice-based version, and we actually avoided that in 2000 with the formation of such institutions as the Victorian Institute of Teachers, and each state has its own accreditation process. But we kept teacher education in the university sector, thank goodness. The Tullian-Tarby report in 1998, you had the educational researchers said that educational researchers were too theoretical and lacked rigour, and it was an extreme attack on feminist research at the time. In the USA, you had the push for data-driven decision-making, and the No Child Left Behind policy said they would not fund any research that was not a random-controlled trial. So at the same time, you had this cross-national, international discourse about the crisis in education, which is promoted in the media and by politicians, and informed by such things as PISA. So this is all fecund ground, this type of attack on education, on teacher education, on teachers, was fecund ground for the social conservatives. And we had the emergence, of course, of the cultural and literacy wars during the 1990s. At the same time, we've got the economic radicalism of marketisation and privatisation. And the Howard government commenced that in Australia in 1996 with attacks on teacher education as being not practical and too much theory, but in fact it was a direct attack on sociology, feminism, multiculturalism and Indigenous knowledges. At the same time, you had the formation in 2000 of what was called the Evidence Informed Policy and Practice Coordinating Centre, the Epicentre, which had systematic reviews based on very large statistical analysis. And I actually did an interview, and there's a paper I wrote in 2002 about what it was like to go and interview these people as they're talking about what counted as evidence. And they would actually look at hundreds and then of addressing a particular research question that was given to them by government. They'd look at hundreds of examples of data and of citations and bring it down, and then they'd basically, so the criteria they were using would just get rid of all the quality research, and then they'd literally get rid of most of the quantity research that didn't particularly have an RCT model, and then they would come out with a recommendation basically that wasn't even anything to do with what they had provided. It was rather terrifying to see how that operated at the time. Then we have the iterative best evidence synthesis, and this is a better way of thinking about it in New Zealand. And actually, it included both qualitative and quantitative data, and they actually were really quite effective reports. And of course, in Australia, we had the Hattie's visible learning, which talked around using questionable statistical methods because it has been contested. that focused on teachers and ignored the whole context around the nature of schools and schooling, and just said we have to have quality teachers and that will solve all the problems. But even Hattie argued that explicit teaching is only one of the 10 high-impact strategies, and I have to say I'm quite shocked to think I'm actually supporting Hattie at this point. Right, so what is the crisis of Australian underachievement that the science of learning is meant to address? Well, first of all, just using the PISA results, which are often abused and misused, but Australia, we know, is considered to be high quality but low equity because of the wide disparity of achievement impacted by the wide disparity of socioeconomic conditions and the long tail largely due to the results of Indigenous students. The NAPLAN data also confirms very much the same point in 2024, and I think that it's just come out again just recently. I haven't looked at that. But it shows that the greater percentage of Indigenous students are in the needs additional support proficiency compared to the non-Indigenous, that the LOBOTE students are exceeding the proficiency level is higher than the non-LBOTE students across all domains, that students who need additional support are lower for those students whose parents hold a bachelor's degree or higher compared to those whose parents' highest level of education is Year 11 completion and below. So in other words, education counts. Percentages in needs additional support proficiency level are the lowest across all 5 domains for students with parents in the senior managers and professionals occupation group. So what the data constantly tells us, and what we know from both PISA and from NAPLAN, is that socioeconomic status, that education levels, professional capital, location and cultural differences matter. Okay, so that's the crisis. And in reading, for example, as Robin Ewing did in an extensive review of literature on reading in 2018, she argued that the predictors which are central to learning to read are things like a language, story, rich home environment where reading and writing for different purposes is modelled and shared, frequent and diverse linguistically rich parent and child oral interactions, the provision of a range of books in the home, and literacy-rich preschool experiences and access to libraries. So again, just reinforcing how the kids bring different capacities to learn to read to school. But reading also, according to ACARA, that is the curriculum that we now address, is that reading includes interpreting, critically analysing and reflecting upon the meaning of a wide range of written and visual print and non-print texts. Meaning making depends on the text type, the purpose of the text, the background of both the reader and the writer, and the wider cultural context of ACARA. So our curriculum documents that talk about the nature of reading here. So if we really thought about the problem of underachievement in Australia, what we know from both the qualitative and the quantitative evidence I've just given you is that we need more targeted policies for those 40% of students who do not achieve the standard or above. And we know that, for example, gender differences in maths and literacies, with girls' results declining in maths and boys in literacy, which is replicated across many countries, that needs a focused responses and targeted programs to address those particular issues. We know that Year 3 students with 33.9% of Indigenous students not achieving, and that this worsens by Year 9. We know that if we actually address the issues of closing the gap, that would actually, and address issues of poor health and housing, which impacts on students' attendance, which also then impacts on their achievement, then that would actually most likely improve the situation of those students. And this is according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. And we know also that socioeconomic issues and parent education levels impact on student outcomes, and that if we actually did focus on in policy resourcing the disadvantaged schools better rather than expending money on non-government schools, then that would make a great difference. What we do know is that even among the 40% of students who are not achieving the standard that is required, that many of them are neurodiverse students or kids with learning difficulties for which phonics is important, but for many that is not necessarily the case. So my argument here is that the notion that phonics is a solution to everything, explicit instruction is the solution to everything is just a very simplistic case that's being put. We also know for the kids, the 60% who are achieving at standard and above, that those that from studies of successful performance in high stakes testing, such as the PISA, that we need to do something to keep them on engaged rather than bored. And we know that Shanghai is often put up as the example of being the place we need to model, but we know that in Shanghai, and I've talked to people who have done this work, that the Shanghai model is a huge amount of investment in professional development. It's a relatively homogeneous student population located in an incredibly rich metropolis that is atypical nationally, even in China. And indeed, the Chinese government is now encouraging this particular model to be spread out across the rest of China. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when they have to address more diverse student populations. Finland likely was lauded for success in PISA. And again, we know that was significant long-term investment over decades in teacher professional development, well-paid teachers, high status, and a relatively monocultural society. Again, those results are reducing because we know that as the society has become more pluralistic, and there's been growing inequality. Again, all of these factors are starting to come into play a lot more in Finland. And the OECD itself reports that the strong performers in successful reformer countries, what they do is that they have improved their reading performance over years by reducing the proportion of poor performing students, which I've already talked about before, how we could do that, and increasing the share of high performers and or weakening the impact of student socioeconomic status on their performance. That is, there's a need for a differentiated approach that recognises the different needs of particular groups of children and the significance of socioeconomic status and cultural differences. And otherwise, we've got 60% of Australian students who already achieve at a high level and exceeding literacy and numeracy, who are now going to be confronted with one way of being taught how to read and how to count. Will this standardisation imposed explicit teaching and phonics enhance the learning of those high-performing students? I doubt it. So, in terms of the evidence or research-based practice, we do know that teachers, when they're thinking about using evidence, that they have multiple ways of thinking what that evidence might be. And right back, there was a study in 2001, because the argument often put here is that teachers do not use evidence. And so to counter that particular argument, we know that there's a very important study that we should actually replicate now, that it was undertaken by the Howard government with the aim to attack educational research, but they found indeed that the 5 different studies said that the Australian research does have an impact on both policy and practice, and stated that the relationship between research and practice was complex, diffuse, indirected, unstructured, and largely mediated. But it did have an impact. And they said that while many teachers did not see their work being informed by research, if you ask them straight out, the impact study indicated that most teachers used key theoretical concepts that did originate in research, but these concepts were disseminated through policy, professional development and their colleagues, and that the exemplary teachers that they talked to cited postgraduate research as stimulating their thinking and changing their thinking and practice. And so there was a whole lot of suggestions here that in fact we do have an impact, but it's not as obvious as we think it could be or should be. We also know from a lot of university-based research that teachers focus on multiple aspects of learning when they're thinking about it. So they don't just look at attainment, they don't just look at reading, they don't just look at standardised assessments, they look at the pedagogical effects as indicated by improved engagements. They look at the social effects in terms of the relationships the students have with each other and with their teachers, and the types of increased levels of competencies and whether they can work in teams. They look at the affective dimension as indicated by students' sense of belonging. They look at the well-being in terms of physical comforts and health, and they look at any behavioural changes related to retention or vandalism or absenteeism, suspensions, etc., any violence, disruption, whatever. All of these incidents are things that teachers look for in their classroom as evidence, as forms of evidence that inform their practice and the decisions they make about teaching. So teachers use a wide range of evidence. So here we are being told now at this particular point that there's only one way of teaching reading and one way of teaching in general, that is explicit or direct instruction, which is teacher-directed instruction standing in front of a classroom. And we know across Australia at the moment, some classrooms are getting rid of tables and groups of chairs. They're now putting in desks straight up facing all the desks now facing the front. So this is about going back to how I was taught in the 1950s, actually, about teacher-directed instruction. Claxton, in his book, The Future of Teaching, Guy Claxton, makes the point here that there's a particular way of thinking about the science of learning. And he argues that this cognitive load theory, and he looks at the history of it, this cognitive load theory and knowledge-rich curriculum were promoted by a small group of researchers right back in the 1980s and 90s. So it also has a similar history. It informed those policies in the UK from the 2000s. The Conservative governments took it up, like Michael Gove, for example, the Education Endowment Foundation. And he makes the argument in his book, and many others have in the same field, that there is no such thing as the learning science. The learning sciences, plural, include multiple forms such as experimental psychology, social and affective neuroscience, cognitive anthropology, developmental psychology, robotics and AI, neurology, systems theory, and many others. But this notion of neuroscience and cognitive sociology rather than the social and behavioural psychology aspects is the thing that has gained the most interest in the evidence-based policy and practice because of its use of statistics and controlled experiments. That is, it just is undertaken in a lab and then just assumed it can be implied and taken into classrooms. And it also informs the notion that there's such things as best practice, etc., that ignores completely the complexity of the types of contexts I've already talked about so far. Okay. Also, the claims that all of the results, such as phonics, is settled, that explicit instruction is settled, and there are no debates about this anymore. There is a high level of contestation even within that narrow field of cognitive psychology. And I picked out just one alternative argument, which argued this comes from the position of cognitive philosophy, which rejects the transient notion of the working memory and the core notion of cognitive load theory, which the cognitive load theory is that students can only learn so much and you can only progress further. And there's even something like now you have to wait until 80% of the classroom understand or master a concept in maths before you progress on to the next concept. So you have these really simplistic models of how to teach being promoted. So they argue, Kim, that the learning model is one which is predictive, not reactive, embodied neuronally plastic, nonlinear and dynamically self-organising and inherently emotional. Now, what they criticise, Sweller, and Sweller is the main promoter of cognitive load theory and is constantly cited in all of these reports that are coming out from Aero and other organisations promoting this particular view of phonics and of explicit instruction. They also argue that the learning of language occurs through multiple other ways, such as repetition, observation, modelling, for example, parents teaching children how to cook or to make things, which confirms a huge body of qualitative literature on home literacy in terms of how children learn language and how to read. Kim also argued that metacognitive strategies that assist students' memory of what is being learnt, not because they ease a putative load on working memory. In other words, there's a whole lot of other strategies that are used to help students learn. And they talk about things such as monitoring and feedback and making things meaningful. They also point out that the notion of learning as an emotional thing is totally ignored in Sweller's theory, and that they argue that really that value and emotional salience play a very important part in learning. And so it's a completely different view about students. Kim and others in this particular article do not view students as empty vessels and passive as assumed in the notions of explicit instruction or cognitive load theory, but that they are active in terms of nonlinear dynamic self-organising and emergent processes involved in learning and development. And as Claxton, they argue, we really still do not know how people learn very well. The dangers of this simplistic pressure on explicit instruction is assumptions about the learner that I've just referred to and how they learn in different subjects. So this notion of explicit instruction and cognitive load theory is also being pushed into maths and science. And Russell Tytler argues that in science, how children learn science is informed by their or misconceptions of how the world works, which is what about context, familial background and experience bring. And they bring, as with any student in any situation, brings a whole lot of cultural baggage and understanding of how the world works. And they say direct instruction certainly has some value at building foundational knowledge and providing scaffolding, but its effectiveness is only when combined with other student-centred, inquiry-based or a balanced approach. But to argue that direct instruction alone in science involves this total separation of the writing in science with any comprehensive linguistic account of grammar, it does not take into account any critical perspective on the function of writing to make sense of science, and doesn't pay attention to the commitment of teachers of science to developing the science of ideas. And likewise in English, all of this ignores the commitment that teachers have in terms of trying to make real their subject area to their students. So Russell Tytler concludes that ERA reports promote false dichotomies, knowledge-rich skills curriculum, knowledge-rich as opposed to skills-based curriculum, explicit versus inquiry instruction, phonics versus balanced language instruction, the brain versus emotions, dichotomies which are not useful or even evident in teacher practice or how teachers teach in current classrooms. So the dangers of the science of learning are that there's the validity of RCTs. We know that the push to use RCTs is the basic form of evidence, but we know that the validity of those, according to Power and Edwards, reduces over time and ignores the social context, which has been a common argument throughout everything I've made so earlier. That RCTs add nothing to the identification of the causal mechanisms triggered by educational interventions, which is why we do quality research. Their results are uninformative for decision making because they are not embedded in the context. Also, another danger is that education is not like the controlled experiments of cognitive load theory, where they're undertaken in some type of clinical environment. They all focus on the individual, but not on the relationships and the context, and we know those relationships are so critical to student learning. For example, the social mix of a classroom has an impact on student achievement. We know that it improves it better for students who are underachieving if they're in a mixed class of achievers. We know that the assumptions underpinning CLT about the brain and learning are disputed by other fields of cognitive science, and the cognitive load theory treats children as an empty vessel, which has to master content before they can think critically. So the notion is even that a child cannot even think critical on their own. Now you've only got to look at the play-based types of pedagogies in early childhood. You know that's not the case. We know that those international examples that they claim have proving that phonics works in the UK and the USA, they actually they do not prove it. In fact, there's multiple studies that show that they don't work in those countries. And then we know that the high-performing countries I've already talked to, what they do to improve student learning is invest heavily in teacher PD. Okay, so the mandated policies of phonics or explicit instruction in reading, maths and science. What is concerning here is that the mandating of the science of learning is equated to direct instruction and knowledge-rich curriculums that is based largely on a very narrow field of disputed cognitive psychology as well as one theory, cognitive load theory, which has been used to justify direct instruction as opposed to other forms of pedagogy. And we know that the applicability of all these types of generalisability of any of these types of research across or any systematic research synthesis that they claim often is what they're doing cannot be generalised across various contexts. Okay, so this is a cartoon I think that is highly appropriate when you think of what is being promoted at the moment. Okay, there's your school, stick your head in it, apply yourself. Okay, that's enough, you're educated and there's your future, get into it. So my next point is, who are the policy actors promoting the science of learning? Because I think this is absolutely critical to all of this. First of all, we know that Gonski, in his report in 2000, said he's been a powerful
Sorry, Jill, we're still on your old slide. We're still on the cartoon.
Okay, well, I'll put share. Thank you.
If you click on Teams, that might bring it back up.
Oh, it might have been what happened, is it? Okay, right. Sorry. Oh, no. Oh, hold on. I have no idea what I've just done here. Thank you. I'll just give it on Teams. Thank you. I have no idea what happened there.
Jill, I can forward those slides if you want.
I've got the slides. It's just a point about what you see. I need to be able to... Is that better now?
Yes. Who are the policy actors promoting science of learning?
Yes, that's it. Right. It just appeared again. Thank you, the teams. That was the thing. Something happened. Apologies to everybody. Okay. Can you see that now? The next slide. Okay. Looking at the rise of the policy actors now that are really shaping this type of education policy, Gonski, who of course wrote the Gonski report, has been a very powerful advocate for public schooling, but at the same time he's also been the chair of the Australian Philanthropic Services, and he's been part of the venture philanthropic organisation Social Ventures Australia, which is a very powerful organisation in education at the moment. He recommended the establishment of an independent national institution tasked with gathering, producing and disseminating evidence-based research modelled on the UK model I referred to earlier, the Education Endowment Foundation, and all of the other various groups such as Social Ventures, the various Big Four, McKinsey, Boston Consultancy Group, Macquarie Bank, all said we should have an organisation such as Arrow. The Productivity Commission in 2016 also was looking at a national evidence base, and it advocated the same model as using the UK model of the Education Endowment Foundation in 2016. Now, we wrote a submission back then in 2016 from Deakin and a group of colleagues, arguing that we were very concerned about how it was going to privilege one type of evidence over other forms of evidence, and having one organisation called the Australian Education Research Organisation would privilege its voice over other voices, and various other arguments that I've already made, so I won't go into that in too much detail. But it was out of the Productivity Commission that Arrow was established in 2020, and it's in a particularly unique role. First of all, it claims to be a body that is there to generate high-quality evidence, to distribute high-quality evidence that is relevant and accessible, to accelerate the use of evidence in the classroom, practice and policy, and that Arrow claims to be bipartisan and independent evidence broker. It is owned by the ministers at the state and federal level, and that's very important to remember that point. Now, if you look at both the Arrow board and the Arrow staff, it becomes quite obvious that all of them pretty much lack any education research expertise. Many of them come from cognitive psychology or quantitative methods background, and many of them come from the former Centre for Evidence from New South Wales, which is in the Department of Education. It is very New South Wales centric. It's linked to philanthropic organisations such as the Ramsay philanthropic organisation, which has Liberal Party connections. There are no sociologists, historians, curriculum or pedagogical researchers in its board or in its staff, and they all have qualifications in public policy or other fields, but not in education. So, I mean, this is, I could go through it in more detail, but basically, right through, these are the Arrow staff, and just briefly, all of them, if you just look at this, there's 3 of those that come from the Centre for Education Statistics. Most of them do research from in the area of cognitive psychology or psychometric analysis, and none of them, other than one principal, have any educational research background. The Arrow board, similarly, is largely all New South Wales centric again, and again, most of them come from areas of social cognitive theory and quantitative research, implementation sciences. Again, there's very little about any education research in there. There's no one with a PhD in education research amongst either the staff or the board. So these are the groups of people who are claiming they are the Australian Education Research Organisation. So the solution to underachievement, as I've argued up to now point, has been that of science of learning, explicit teaching and phonics. So Jenny Jonathan, who's the director of Arrow, makes this claim. We look at what the evidence says about the best way to manage disruption and disengagement in the classroom, and the evidence came down behind the explicit teaching approach. It's often described as the behaviour curriculum, but that's really reflecting a sense, like other parts of the curriculum, it needs to be explicitly taught. It explains to teachers the role they have in making sure the classroom is an environment that's conducive to learning. It's part what needs to be in place so that they can undertake the rest of the work of teaching and learning. So in other words, they're saying that the explicit instruction is a behaviour management model. That's the first point. That's the claim being made. At the Senate committee select Committee on Education and Employment in June of 2024. Evidence was given by Dr. Jenny Donovan, and I just wanted to extract some of the direct quotes from that particular thing. The Senator Orman, the Green Senator, Senator Orman Payne, asked such questions such as, could you outline for me how ERO engages with the established education research community? And Dr. Donovan said, what do you mean by the established education and research community? Do you mean the university sector? And Payne said, yes. And she replied, there are other bodies like ACR, for example, that are part of the community, and we often commission work from them. And then we have a project, we'll often tender and seek expressions of interest, etc. And they have met with the Australian Council of Deans on occasion. So basically, there's no interest at all in really addressing any of the issues around the so-called university research sector. Payne then asked, no, I'm interested to know how ERO measures the impact of its work. How do you do that? And she said, well, we wrestle with that. It's really hard. She makes the point, our impact is not that direct. Our impact really relies on jurisdictions, on systems and sectors being engaged and interested in the work we do to the extent that we will promote and advocate it to their workforce. So basically, they are in a privileged position with direct access to all the ministers. They can walk in and ask to meet with the ministers, and then they can present the reports directly to the ministers. Hence the rapid speed with which a lot of what they've suggested comes out. She then asks the work, Payne then asks about the work around explicit instruction, etc. And she said, you say that explicit instruction is a settled science, and Dr. Donovan says yes, and then Payne asks what evidence, and she says we've gone through a robustly evidence-based approach to cognitive science and our most recent understandings of how our brains learn and how information and knowledge are absorbed and retained in long-term memory. We have an understanding of how the brain learns and an approach to teaching that matches the way brains learn. Students will get overloaded if they try and give them too much, if you make them do the guesswork. If you can chunk it down to what you want them to learn into small pieces, you can build the connections with them and give them a chance to practice and ensure their mastery. Then you can move on. Okay, so it keeps on going on in a similar vein, okay, about that the contestation and suggestions that perhaps maybe what she suggests is not agreed on by a lot of education academics. And she says, well, yes, perhaps that's the case. But it's just an interesting analysis to see how she is able to argue and make a case about how teachers should teach and how students learn in a highly contested area. So what is the issue here? The science of learning. In any form of systematic inquiry, the evidence we know is never settled. It's always under review. That the greater legitimacy given to RCTs or studies undertaken in a controlled environment is the only form of evidence is dangerous. And we know even medical practitioners say that RCTs provide probabilities and patterns, but these do not necessarily apply to an individual case, which is where the practitioners with professional expertise make judgments for a patient in context. The science of learning, explicit or direct instruction and phonics cannot be promoted as a universal solution right across all contexts. The claim that it improves behaviour management fails to even define the nature of behavioural disruption. And we know that teachers now face multiple factors impacting on student behaviour, and the advocates of explicit instruction ignore what and how teachers already teach literacy as balanced instruction includes phonics as well as other forms of teaching. Okay. So ERO as a body does not call on any of the body of university research. Indeed, it denigrates it. It makes causal claims for explicit instruction without evidence. It assumes a narrowing frame of cognitive psychology, which is contested. It ignores the context of schools, student background, which impacts on achievement. It has direct access to ministers because it's funded by them and has one person designated to actually do that work in each state. Now, I'm not going to go into any more detail too much, but the Grattan Institute also, which claims to be a progressive institute, has been promoting exactly the same philosophies as ERO, and actually in this circuit of closed influence, actually is promoting the very policies that ERO is promoting at the same time. And again, if you look at the staff in the Grattan Institute in the education sector, there's only one person with a PhD and it's not in education, and other people who are working there do not even have PhDs in the field. And so we have, again, people outside the field of education research now telling us how we are meant to be teaching and what the research should be. So there's been various reports that have come out of Grattan, such as the Reading Guarantee report, again prioritising the very notions that are being promoted through Aero. And there's other knowledge brokers in this as well. There's the Centre for Independent Studies, which is also drawing on the science of maths and how to apply it, which is funded by the Cormac Foundation, which is a very right-wing think tank. And again, it's from a psychologist. We've got the Institute of Public Affairs. They're trying to promote various things. Pam Snow, who's at the University of La Trobe, who does work on assisting children with learning difficulties as a one-on-one basis, has now been, because she promotes the same types of cognitive load theory, has just received a significant amount of money to promote the same things. And so we have this, what I would say is a very much, Teach for Australia does the same thing as well. And there's a whole online website that teachers use now called Okra, which offers all the online materials for grounding, explicit teaching and phonics. So my argument here is we've got a closed circuit of influence, which is anti-educational research. It's based on a narrow evidence base of cognitive psychology, plus social conservatism and privatised knowledge brokers. And so it's a worrying convergence of these various groups together, promoting policies and then being adopted in such a wholesale manner and being mandated down onto teachers when none of them have really any education research expertise at all. The problem is also that these are influential because they're easy to go places for journalists who are too lazy to look up university websites where it is possible to search for an expert, and they just go to the usual IPS or to Aero or to Grattan. Okay, so I'm just aware of the time. Just to say that in the research policy nexus, I think the point I'm trying to make here is it's very different at this current moment because of the direct influence of Aero and these other bodies on education policy and the speed with which it's happened. And we know that research policy relationship is always one that's been problematic. It's always one that we try to work out ourselves. We're always asked to try and make ourselves present more consumable research. But at the moment, there's an extreme worry about what is happening in the current context. So the enduring paradoxes of this research policy nexus is that we know governments impose policies that are often a mix of ideology and evidence, and we know that policies are sometimes performative, and we know that they often use selective research post hoc to justify it. We know that policy is often driven by ideology, economic theory and political expediency. We know that they don't usually evaluate anything and that they want simple solutions to complex problems that can be scaled up. And in particular, that is the last point, is that what Aero and these various organisations are doing is they are offering very simple solutions that they promise can be scaled up across all education contexts. And we know that also the relationship between university research-based and government and policymakers is always a very tenuous and difficult one that changes depending upon the politics of governments in power. So I just won't go on, I'll finish at this point, but I've already made a lot of these points already. So I suppose the main irony is this, that first of all, this body that doesn't do any educational research, but is called Australian Educational Research Organisation, actually does not accept any of the body of education research that is funded by the Australian government, for example, in ARCs or other forms of funding that we gain to do our research. So the name itself is a misnomer. Secondly, the big problem here is that here we've got poor quality research being put out in reports and being implemented totally across the sector. And it therefore it's bad policy. So it's poor quality research informing bad policy. And we also know that that the impact of this on teachers is that many of them are saying we're being treated with absolute disdain, our professional expertise is being ignored, and we are going to leave the profession. So it's just incredibly worrying that this is the type of thing that is being implemented at this particular time. So I'm going to finish on that.